Welcome back to another edition of the City That Never Sleeps show. I'm your host, Brandon Pockris, and I will be here by myself on the show today because Austin will not be able to make it. Austin, he has some class obligations. He actually just started a new internship, so excited for him, and he will be back on the show whenever he can, but his schedule is filled up a little bit more. So next week, there will be a new co host that will be filling in for Austin until he is able to return to the show. And in the meantime, me and that other co host will carry the show throughout the spring, up until the summer. So, show keeps rolling. It's going to be, as good as it's been. It's going to still be fun, still going to be interacting with all you guys. And as the sports world transitions more from, the end of the NFL season to the in-depth of basketball and hockey, and as baseball gets started up, there's as much New York sports to cover as always. The Knicks are most likely going to be in a playoff hunt. The Rangers are going to be in a playoff hunt. You're going to have the Mets and Yankees who are looking to improve on already good seasons from last year. And it's just going to be a dearth of information to cover. It's going to be just widespread news everywhere. And that's not even discounting the NFL, because the NFL, I'm sure there's going to be stories surrounding the Jets this offseason whenever they decide to hire their offensive coordinator, and the Giants as they try to improve on a season that up to this point is still continuing, and other NFL news, obviously. So without further ado, we have a lot of information to get to today. A lot of fun stuff happened over the weekend. So let's get it started. I'd be remiss if I started anywhere else besides the New York Giants. And as you guys can see, bottom of the screen, question of the day: the New York Giants will beat the Philadelphia Eagles. Agree or disagree? And the reason that is the case is because this past weekend, the New York Giants defeated the Philadelphia Eagles. They were victorious, or not, they defeated the Philadelphia Eagles. They defeated the Minnesota Vikings. That game was a score of, as I pull it up so I get that 100% correct, they won by a score of 31-24 in the wild card round. Now, this was a game, watched the entire thing, where both teams were playing pretty well. And I'll be honest, not sure how much stock to put into the Giants themselves, not sure how much stock to put into a Minnesota defense that has been exploited countless times this season. But I'd be remiss if I said anything else at the top of the show regarding the Giants other than Daniel Jones probably played the best game of his career, if not one of the best games of his career. We pull up the stats here. Jones, on the day, was 24-35 for 301 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 0 interceptions. He also carried the ball 17 times for 78 yards, averaging 4.6 yards per carry. I feel like that's the best place to start because, with those numbers, Jones had almost double the carries Saquon had, on top of throwing the ball as much as he did. He was, for all intents and purposes, the engine for that offense. The Vikings, for whatever reason, they played and beat the Giants earlier in the year. They were not prepared for the amount of times that Daniel Jones was going to carry the ball. Just it was clear as day. Jones was running through people, running around people, doing all these different things where, it was keeping the Vikings defense off balance. And time again in the quote unquote new age of the NFL, we see that mobile quarterbacks, put this pressure on defenses that a lot of them just can't handle. And it's a guy like Jones where, for whatever reason, defenses aren't always keyed in on his mobile ability. He takes advantage of the fact that it's man coverage, that there's no one open, but there's space to run. It opens up so much more of an offense for a guy like Daboll, Mike Kafka, who is getting head coach interviews due to his work as the offensive coordinator for the Giants. It opens up so much more because now the defense can't just key in on one thing. They can't run as much man. They can't run as much, tight coverage and force the receivers to get separation, because the minute you do that, you're opening yourself up to the scramble ability of Jones. Versus if you sit back in zone, you're now allowing Jones to hit all these different passes underneath. It was just a really, really, really good game. Jones was hitting almost every throw he had. Jones was on target. There wasn't that crippling mistake that, we're sometimes used to seeing from him. There wasn't that big fumble. And that was just really good on the Giants' part. And then you look at the other aspects of the offense, which are very important to get into as well. Saquon Barkley, 9 carries for 53 yards, yet he also had 2 touchdowns. Saquon is a huge, huge, huge part of the Giants' success. I called him the engine of the offense earlier in the year, and I feel like now you could expand that to it's Jones and Barkley. That's the way the offense moves, both in the air and on the ground, because in the air, Saquon also had 5 catches for 56 yards. He had over 100 yards from scrimmage. It's very, very important that these guys are clicking on all cylinders if the Giants want to keep playing their best football and have a shot to move forward in the playoffs. And there is another unsung hero. I'm trying to say that word. Always fun. But Isaiah Hodgins. We talk about Jones, obviously, the quarterback. He's a free agent at the end of the year. For all intents and purposes, it seems like the Giants are going to keep him. I think it'd be a huge mistake if they didn't. He's made so much progress under Brian Daboll. I'm excited to see what a second year in that system would be. Obviously, Saquon is Saquon. But Isaiah Hodgins, in this game, 8 catches, 105 yards, and a touchdown. Obviously, Darius Slayton had a good game as well, 4 catches, 88 yards. But Hodgins, in 9 games since he's been with the Giants, has 41 catches, 446 receiving yards, and 5 touchdowns. This is a guy that was claimed off the waiver wire from the Buffalo Bills practice squad. This is a guy that no other team wanted. The Giants were the only team that put in a claim for him. And he's proving that he probably should be a piece of their offense moving forward. He's proving that, at least for the time being, he can be that go-to guy in an offense that needed someone like that at receiver. Now, by no means am I calling him, A.J. Brown or Justin Jefferson or, one of these upper echelon receivers in the league. But he's a good wide receiver too right now, going forward. And right now he can serve as that wide receiver 1. Darius Slayton, all these different guys, they're not these name brand, I'd say, type receivers where they're attracting all this attention media-wise, but they're getting the job done for the Giants. On the defensive side of the ball, the Giants didn't exactly have what I would call a great game. Dalvin Cook averaged 4 yards a carry. He had 15 carries, 60 yards. Kirk Cousins, 31-39 for 273 yards and 2 touchdowns. T.J. Hawkinson, 10 catches, 129 yards. But they were able to shut down Justin Jefferson after the first drive of the game. He only finished the game with 7 catches for 47 yards. No other receiver besides Hawkinson had over 50 yards. And, the Giants, quite frankly, they did enough. They did enough on defense to stop a high-powered Minnesota offense and win the game. It goes back to what we said on last week's show when we brought up this Giants game. The keys to victory that we said were, can you get that crucial stop against Minnesota and not turn the ball over? Not be the team that loses the turnover battle. And they weren't. The Giants kept scoring. And they were able to get that stop on the Vikings where, they forced them to a field goal a few times. They didn't allow them to just drive down the field and score touchdowns every single possession. And that was critical because the offense was on, as we predicted, and the defense came up big when they needed to. Overall, it's a huge, huge, huge win for the Giants. And, it's their first playoff win since 2012. It's very, very, very cool to see, teams breaking playoff droughts. We'll get to the team with the biggest one in the NFL a little bit later. But, this is a team that does have talent. The guys on the offensive side of the ball. You have Dexter Lawrence, who, according to the Next Gen stats, recorded a team-high 8 pressures in the Giants' playoff win. They have Kayvon Thibodeau development. They got McKinney back on the back end. They got Adoree Jackson back on the back end. They're getting healthy and they're clicking on all cylinders at a time where they really needed to. At a time where they needed to click on all cylinders and truly find a way to really get consistent and stay consistent. And that brings us to the poll, and that brings us to the upcoming game against the Philadelphia Eagles. This is a game taking place Saturday, January 21st at 8:15 p.m. on Fox. The Giants are traveling to Philly to take on the Eagles. And, it's a division game. Division games are crazy. You never truly know what's going to happen. And it boils down to, can the Giants play more like they did in the second game as opposed to how they did in the first game? They got ran off the field in the first game for all intents and purposes, and they competed with their backups in the second game. Now, in the chat, we got Brian Daly saying big win for the Giants. We got Joshua saying, LOL, dream on. We will get to my thoughts on this game in a little bit, and I see that you disagree. Brian, once again, saying he disagrees to the poll. And we got Jake in the chat saying, I disagree with the poll. The Vikings defense is putrid compared to the Eagles. It'll be a close game, but the Eagles will pull out the win. So where I really fall on this, and I feel like it's two-pronged because there is a key facet I'm looking at on both sides of the ball in this game. Number one, the health of Jalen Hurts is absolutely paramount to how this game will go. The fact that the Eagles got the number 1 seed helped them immensely in this regard. But Hurts in Week 18, it was his first game back. And I think it was good that he was able to push himself to get onto the field because, quite frankly, if he didn't have a game before this matchup, I would be still picking the Eagles to win, but it would be more of a pessimistic outlook in the sense of we don't know how he's going to play. The fact that he got on the field, he showed he's getting back to his form earlier in the year when he was healthy, is extremely critical for the Eagles' success. We saw Minshew commanding that offense. And while Minshew was decent, it was evident to see that Hurts brought a different level to the Eagles' offense than what Minshew or really any other quarterback in that system has. So if he is as healthy as I think he will be, if he is as healthy as I think he is after having that bye week, I think the Eagles' defense should not have too many issues moving the ball on the Giants. I think they may run into some issues running the ball, but I think the passing game is going to be very successful. So that's where I stand with the Giants on defense. Will they be able to shut down Hurts? That remains to be seen. They did a decent job of it in Week 18. Like I said, looking at those stats, if we pull them up, just from a numerical standpoint, Hurts had 229 yards, 0 touchdowns, and 1 interception. He also added 13 yards on the ground on 9 carries. Really, by his standards, not a good game whatsoever. And really, by quarterback standards, not a good game whatsoever. So if the Giants are somehow able to get that type of performance out of Hurts, they're going to have a really good shot to win this game. I don't know if that happens. I don't think that happens. I think the Eagles are a lock to put up at least 20 points in this game. I think that between the health of Hurts and the running backs not having another week of wear and tear and maybe getting some of those pieces a little bit healthier on the offensive line, that's going to be critical for the Eagles' success. Because with how talented the Eagles are, they need all their guys because the Giants have talent on the front four, because the Giants are getting some of their guys healthier in that secondary. But I think the Eagles have the clear advantage against the Giants defense. Now, flipping to the other side of the ball, I think the key for the Giants keeping this one close is, can they overcome, quite frankly, a stifling Philly defense? Jake brought up an amazing point, and that's really where I fall on this. As good as the Giants played this past week against the Vikings defense is terrible. Dive a little bit more into the numbers, look a little bit more. The Vikings had one of the worst defenses in the league, whether it's yardage, EPA, all these different stats. You look at those types of things. The Vikings really should not probably have been as high of a ranked playoff team as they were. This is a team where, they were 11-0 in one-score games. That quite frankly, that doesn't happen in the NFL and any sport. Having that much luck in one-score games, you could argue it's a skill, but when you have, like Philly Irish Drew Evo says, the 31st pass defense in terms of the Vikings, this isn't, sustainable. It wasn't sustainable. And you saw what happens with that. Even with Isaiah Hodgins and Darius Slayton as your number one receivers, essentially, you're putting up over 300 passing yards on the Vikings. That's not going to happen against this Eagles defense. I'd say, maybe a 250 and 1-1, maybe a 202 game is more likely. But there's not going to be this same amount of room to pass. Quite frankly, there's not going to be the same amount of room to operate against the Eagles. It's just facts. This is an Eagles defense that has really done a really, really good job of shutting things down against opposing offenses. Getting to some more comments, we got Joseph saying Eagles 38, Giants 17. He also says he disagrees. And we got Greg in the chat saying he also disagrees to the poll. This is, it's going to be very interesting because while I do think that this game has the potential to be close, I'm not extremely confident in that happening. I think the Giants lose this game. I personally disagree with the poll. I don't think the Giants win this game because I think what they need to have go in their favor against the Eagles in this game is what the Eagles are best suited to not allow to happen. I trust the Eagles to have a good offensive game plan. I trust the Eagles to, have Jalen Hurts be ready to roll. I trust the Eagles to have a good plan to limit what was working for the Giants in the game against Minnesota. I trust the Eagles to limit, and this is most importantly, as Greg says, Daniel Jones's legs will be the X factor. If he's effective like this past week, it'll be a long night. I think the Eagles will have an opportunity, and they will have a game plan to limit Daniel Jones to a point where he has to operate more in the pocket. He has to operate down the field, and he has to rely on, quite frankly, a receiver group that isn't all that heralded. Now, could it happen? Absolutely. It's the NFL. As we'll get to in some of the other playoff games, literally anything can happen. But where I sit right now, I think that the Eagles win this game, like a 28-17 score, a 30-20 score, something in that range. I'm going to put it on a 28-17. That's what I'm predicting. And I think that the Giants keep it close for the majority, but they're just not able to do enough against the Eagles defense. And I think on the flip side, the Eagles defense does enough to score on the Giants. This is probably, looking at the other playoff games this weekend, this is probably the least exciting game out of them, to be honest. But this also has potential to be the biggest upset if things go right for the Giants. So, all in all, to really recap that, incredible victory for the Giants. Daniel Jones looks like a keeper as the guy. He's shown this throughout the year. It hasn't just been against Minnesota. But I think unless Daniel Jones has another career-type game, unless Darius Slayton and Isaiah Hodgins are able to find room against Darius Slay and James Bradbury and Chauncey Gardner-Johnson in that Eagles secondary, I just don't see how the Giants are able to score enough to keep up with the Eagles. I don't think it happens. I don't think the Giants offense has enough weapons, and we've talked about this. The Giants need an X factor number one wide receiver. As good as Hodgins, Slayton, Richie James at times have been, you needed a receiver to pair with Jones, with Barkley, with the rest of this offense. And that's where, in my opinion, is going to shine the most in this game, where you don't have that number one guy that can get open against a Slay, that can get open against a Bradbury. And that's going to really turn into, okay, we see that the Giants are a team on the upswing, but this is also a team that is another season away from truly competing for a higher playoff seed, a higher, playoff advancement, have a shot to actually make it past the first round. Because I don't think they're on the Eagles level yet, and I think that this game is going to show that once again. In the chat, we got Philly Irish Drew Evo saying all you need to do is rush 5. And he predicts that the Eagles win this game 34-14. I'm seeing a lot of the chats. Also, you got him saying Giants are bad against tight ends. 100%. Linebackers are not a strength for this Giants team. We saw TJ Hawkinson have another huge game. Dallas Goedert, I think, is going to have a really good game. That kind of seems, not, I wouldn't say set in stone, but I would not be surprised to see that. I see a lot of chats thinking the Eagles just wipe the floor with the Giants. And, that's always a possibility. You never truly know with these things. But I think the Eagles win, but I think it's a lot closer than people admit. And maybe that casts some doubt over, whether or not the Eagles are this quote-unquote favorite in the NFC over the 49ers. But that's a discussion that will be had and can be had after this weekend of games. So before we move on, I want to remind you guys that Creative Window Design Center, serving New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Florida. They're fully authorized Hunter Douglas dealer. Contact Jeff at 609-226-0391 for a free consultation. Also, All Campus is giving 20% off everything in their store, including hats and shirts to all their subscribers. So make sure to get in on that. Moving on. As promised, we're talking more NFL. And these playoffs, man, there were some interesting games. And quite frankly, there were some not so interesting games. I think the best place to start, if we're going in a chronological order, is the Seahawks 49ers game. Now, what can really be drawn from this? And before we move on, we got Rob in the chat saying, think it will be a lot closer than people think. Beat Eagles win. Yep, as everyone in the chat has said, Eagles probably going to win this game. Moving in a chronological order here, I think that my biggest takeaway from the playoff games this past weekend is that I think the 49ers, and somehow I feel like this is still happening, but I feel like the 49ers are in a way, and I'm not saying 100%, I feel like they're being discounted for how, talented they actually are. And I think a lot of that is because of the quarterback. As good as Brock Purdy has played, and this is really how I see it, as good as Brock Purdy has played, 18 to 30, 332 yards, 3 touchdowns. Another impressive performance by the Mr. Irrelevant pick in this past year's draft. I think that the reason I value the 49ers performance so much is because of what they're doing on defense and the fact that I trust Kyle Shanahan to game plan against basically anybody. You got Christian McCaffrey going for 119 yards on the ground, also adding 17 yards and a touchdown in the air. You have Debo going for 133 yards and a touchdown. Ayuk going for 73. You have Jawan Jennings and George Kittle chipping in, along with Elijah Mitchell. It's just, at least from an offensive perspective, right? The 49ers are this team where they can hit you from all sides. They're a team that, they have just this, what feels like this unlimited amount of, skill talent on that side of the ball. And, as bad as Seattle's defense can be, as Joseph in the chat says, Seattle's defense was average at best. This is something that just has happened down the entire stretch of this season. The 49ers just have been on an absolute tear with Purdy at the helm. And I don't think it's because Purdy is this world beater. Oh, he's the second coming of Brady type player. Maybe he reaches that point someday. But I think, and as we've talked about a lot on the show in regards to the Jets, when you have a guy that just seamlessly executes the offense the way it's supposed to be, it's very easy to move the ball down the field when you get the ball in the hands of your skill guys. When you consistently get the ball in the hands of McCaffrey, when you get the ball in the hands of Debo, Ayuk, Kittle, when you're protected with a great offensive line led by Trent Williams, it's very easy to play offense. It's very easy to play quarterback. And when you have enough talent to just run the offense the way it's supposed to function, you've run into this part where, you have questions about, okay, what happens if things break down? But then on the other hand, okay, how far can Shanahan's scheme take this team? That's really the balance you run into with this. And then, I think the bigger thing is the 49ers defense is just fast and very, very, very good. Nick Bosa is just an absolute force. Dre Greenlaw, Fred Warner, incredible linebacker tandem. Taluna Hufanga in the secondary, great player. That's not even counting Arik Armstead and, Javon Kinlaw on that defensive line. There's just a lot of talent on both sides of the ball for the 49ers. They kind of, after the first half, just completely overpowered the Seahawks in the second half. scoring 7 and 18 points in the third and fourth quarters, limiting the Seahawks to 6 total points in the second half, really shut down Geno in the passing attack after the first half. There was just so many marks of a great team in this game, between the adjustments after halftime, between the offense clicking on all cylinders, between the defense getting the stops when they needed it. And I'm personally convinced, as we look towards some of the games coming up, and we'll do that before we move on to some teams that aren't in the playoffs and some coach firings, I'm very interested to see how the 49ers do this weekend. But I truly think we are heading for a Philadelphia Eagles, San Francisco 49ers collision course. We talked about, obviously, we think the Eagles are going to defeat the Giants. But I'm really interested to see this Cowboys 49ers game. But I truly think we are heading towards a collision course between the 49ers and the Eagles for the NFC title. Moving on to the other game that was played on Saturday. Yeah, this one was a doozy. The Jacksonville Jaguars defeated the Los Angeles Chargers by a score of 31-30. And I don't know if there's any other place to start, even just discussing this game in the smallest portion, than I can't believe the Chargers did it again. You talk about teams that are cursed, the Jets. You could talk about the Vikings being cursed in a way. The Bills, before the Josh Allen era began, being cursed. I don't think there's any more team more cursed in the NFL than the Los Angeles Chargers. And I truly don't know a better way to explain that than through what happened this past weekend. So the Los Angeles Chargers went into halftime with a 27-7 lead. They had forced 4 Trevor Lawrence interceptions. They had controlled the entire game. And, right before halftime, if you look at it, the Jaguars score on an Evan Engram touchdown to make it 27-7. And then after that, Trevor Lawrence completely flipped the switch, threw for 4 touchdowns in the second half of the game. The Chargers offense completely stalled out, could only settle for field goals at the maximum, and they ended up losing this game. Doug Peterson breaks out the Philadelphia Eagles play from a few weeks ago where they line up in the old-fashioned formation, make it look like their QB sneaking, give it to Travis Etienne. Etienne runs for a huge gain. Jaguars set up the game-winning field goal. It's very easy to talk about, look at how Jacksonville bounced back. Look at how, Trevor Lawrence improved from half to half. Look at how Doug Peterson game plan. All valid points. And I think those are going to be critical as they move to play against Kansas City. But I think the best place to really evaluate this game is, quite frankly, in my opinion, I was expecting this from the Chargers. Not the complete, meltdown, not blowing one of the biggest leads in NFL playoff history, but I was expecting them to lose. Looking at last week, should have been no reason why starters were playing. You lost Mike Williams. Let's face it, despite the big lead, having Mike Williams in that second half, Chargers probably win that game. He's that good of a player for them. And time again, we've seen this with the Chargers offense. They refused to push the ball down the field. And this resulted in the offensive coordinator, Joe Lombardi, being fired, in my opinion. this offense refused to use one of the strongest quarterbacks in the league in terms of arm talent. They refused to use Herbert's strengths on a consistent basis. Borderline, they turned him into a check down Charlie type quarterback, a guy that was not throwing passes beyond 10 or so yards. They turned him into this quarterback that was just, I feel like half the time throughout this entire season, especially with how much of the Chargers games were on prime time, check down, short pass. And look, I get it. Keenan Allen's great at those routes. You have Austin Eckler, who's an absolute dynamo in the passing game. But when you have a superstar talent like Justin Herbert, you have to open up the offense. You have to push the ball down the field. And quite frankly, that was not happening enough. That did not happen in the second half of this game. We got Joseph in the chat saying the Chargers should have ran the ball. You see, I would love to agree with you there. But the Chargers' run game, especially with the huge amount of injuries on the O-line, just wasn't working. Eckler could not find any space. Joshua Kelly, any of the other backs, could not find any space. And I feel like that ties back into the same point where when you have an offense that is operating on such a basis where you're only finding these short passes, guess what? The defense isn't going to feel threatened down the field. The defense is going to creep those safeties up, play press with the cornerbacks. And when that happens, when everyone's closer to the line of scrimmage, you're not as spread out. You're fixated on, what's going to happen in the short area of the field. That's where you have less success running the ball. If you really look at it, so many of these good teams use the pass to set up the run. Why did the Bills, and I feel like they're not the best example, but why can the Bills have success in their run game? Because Josh Allen is a threat at any time to launch the ball 50 yards down the field to one of his receivers. Mahomes, the reason the Chiefs' run game has found more success is Andy Reid's smart enough to use the pass to set up the run. The Eagles are maybe a bit of a different story here, but because Hurts has shown a better ability this year to push the ball down the field, to threaten the deeper halves of the field with A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, Quez Watkins, you now have more room to operate as a team running the football. I feel like it's also not that simple, but it's clear to see when everything's short, when everything is, in front of the line of, not in front of the line of scrimmage, but the line of the game, when you're not really executing that many passes, 10, 15 yards down the field, teams key in on that. And I think really that's what befell the Chargers. They also didn't utilize Herbert's athleticism. They didn't utilize his arm strength. And when you don't play to a quarterback's strengths, you run into issues. We see this time again. Now the Chargers are in a spot where, just like the Commanders, just like the Jets, just like some of these other teams, you now need a guy that can work with the quarterback and develop an offense that suits his strengths and, most importantly, the offensive strengths. On the Chargers front, they need to get Jalen Guyton back. I did not realize going into this year how important he would be, but losing that deep threat really limited the Chargers. They need a deep threat badly. I know this is the easy name to bring up, but Jalen Hyatt from Tennessee, I'm not sure how high he's going to be selected. I really think the Chargers should target him. There's going to be some other deep threats, maybe like a Marvin Mims later in the draft. I feel like that's a missing component to the Chargers offense. And if they get a coordinator that is not going to be, content with just, let's just short pass it. I think the more you open up the offense for Herbert, the better the Chargers are going to be. moving on to the next game chronologically in terms of how the schedule went. You got the Bills narrowly defeating the Dolphins. And, you know, on the Miami side of things, the team that was eliminated, Skylar Thompson and admirable effort. Him and McDaniel in terms of the play calling, Thompson in terms of executing that offense. We talked about that with Purdy a little bit. I think they did the best that they could in terms of the limitations. Obviously, Thompson isn't Tua in terms of getting the ball out and moving the offense and, operating it to that same level. But, it was a decent performance. And the Miami defense in the second half of this game, especially, they came to play. They truly forced Josh Allen into a lot of how do I put this? Circumstances that caused him to play like a chicken with its head cut off. And I think that's the really best way to go about explaining Josh Allen here. Because, focusing on the team that advanced in the playoffs here, Josh Allen on the day was 23 of 39, 352 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Obviously, you have James Cook and Singletary averaging over 3 yards a carry, Cook at 3.2, Singletary 4.8, Diggs and Davis. Diggs had 7 for 114. Davis had 113 and 1. Khalil Shakir also added 51 yards receiving. When I looked at this game, when I was watching this game, I feel like Buffalo, in a vein where, you could argue it's kind of similar to the Chargers. They probably could have ran the ball a little bit more. I'm pretty sure that's what Joseph is alluding to, where he's saying they should have bled the clock. Buffalo does have talented backs. They have James Cook. They have Devin Singletary, both who have shown that they're talented and can handle the ball for this high playoff caliber team. But Josh Allen is I wouldn't say prototypical, but above average, take the good with the bad type quarterback. If you guys follow me on Twitter, you probably have seen me tweet about the absolutely ridiculous throws that Josh Allen has made. This is a guy that literally, from sitting in the pocket, can just flick his wrist and hit a throw 50, 55 yards down the field, opposite hash, into a guy in stride. Absolutely ridiculous arm talent. He also has mobility that is incredible as well. On the game, he had 20 yards rushing as well. But when you have that type of talent and you're able to play like that, I wouldn't say Newton, as in Cam Newton, played like this, but you have sometimes a tendency to play a little reckless, a little loose with the football. Josh Allen, with that type of arm strength and that type of mobility, and basically him embodying borderline Superman on the field, you sometimes see him get to this mantra where he is playing like he has some heavy metal theme going on in his head and thinks he can do anything on a football field. You could argue he has just like the guitar solo from Black Sabbath or AC/DC going on as he's trying to fit a throw in a window that maybe one other quarterback in the league would even attempt. And, that's where you run into these issues with him because the Bills jump out to a giant lead. Josh Allen makes a few mistakes that honestly probably could have been avoided. Probably could have been, I should probably throw this away. I'll take the check down here and live to fight another day. But that's not how Josh Allen plays. It's not how he plays. It's never how he's played. And he probably will have to learn to play that way as his career progresses. But right now, that's just not him. And you got to this point where, okay, now the Bills are down. How are they going to overcome this? And, against a Miami-led offense with Skylar Thompson, these different players, even with having Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, they had drops. Miami could have had an even bigger lead in this game. Thompson had 2 interceptions. Josh Allen needs to probably rein it back a little bit, or the Bills need to, throw a few more run plays into the game plan versus, hey, Josh Allen's just going to chuck this ball down the field and try to hit every single deep ball that he possibly can. Because I truly think that, as you progress in the playoffs, those type of mistakes are going to be backbreaking. You're not playing the Skylar Thompson-led Dolphins anymore. You're going to be playing a Mahomes, potentially. You're playing a Burrow this upcoming week. You're potentially playing a Trevor Lawrence. From the NFC side, you might be playing a Dak Prescott, a Jalen Hurts. You're playing defenses, on the NFC side, potentially the 49ers and the Eagles. The AFC side, potentially the Bengals. You're going to be playing teams that if you make those type of mistakes, you're going to cost your team not just possession, but also, points. You're going to cost them points. And obviously you have the interaction with Christian Wilkins showing that frustration. I think this was just for some reason, a highly emotional game for the Bills. This is the second game after the Damar Hamlin situation, which incredible to see him doing so well. Incredible to see him that he was potentially trying to get to the stadium for the game. Obviously, came out that he couldn't make it there, but it's incredible to see him moving like that, especially after the scary situation. But, I think that in a way, it's beneficial that the Bills went through this game, went through that adversity where now heading into an important game against the Bengals, they know they can't make those mistakes anymore, and they have to be tighter in their execution and game plan in how they attack one of the best teams in the AFC that is still remaining. The last 2 games that happened were the Bengals and Ravens game. The Bengals Ravens, tight, typical AFC North battle. You have Joe Burrow throwing for a touchdown and 209 yards. Jamar Chase having a good game as usual, 9 receptions, 84 yards and a touchdown. But I think the real talking point from this game, Cincinnati's defense is legit. Whether the Sam Hubbard insane fumble recovery touchdown or the Bengals forcing Huntley into a crucial interception or the Bengals D-line getting after the quarterback. This is a Bengals defense that got hot at the right moment. And, Tyler Huntley played a pretty good game, but he couldn't overcome, his own mistake in terms of fumbling the ball, which Trevor Lawrence is a bad influence because who knows if Huntley attempts that, if Lawrence doesn't do that the night before. Ravens coaches came out after the game and spoke about how, Huntley probably should have just went underneath instead of trying to go over the top. All that's a moot point. The Ravens were always a tough team. The Ravens have a very, very, very good defense. And once again, Cincinnati, the battle-tested team that they are, were able to overcome, a tough divisional game where, they had to push forward and they had to deal with the adversity of having to surmount a lead that Baltimore built up. And then the final game before we talk about the upcoming playoff matchups, because I'm really looking forward to discussing these. You got the Dallas Cowboys absolutely throttling the Tampa Bay Buccaneers Dak Prescott looked insane. 305 yards, 4 touchdowns. Tony Pollard, great game on the ground, averaged 5.5 yards per carry. Dalton Schultz eviscerated the Buccaneers defense. 7 catches, 95 yards, and 2 touchdowns. CeeDee Lamb and Gallup also added a touchdown. Quite frankly, Dallas looked like the better team there. Tampa Bay, as much as I thought that Tom Brady was going to pull off the upset, they, right from the opening kickoff, it looked like they had no shot. Brady looked, quite frankly, his age, playing quarterback out there, wasn't hitting passes as well, was trying to avoid pressure at all costs. And Dallas proved that, they belong. Even after faltering last week against Washington, they proved that they belong in the playoffs this week. That brings us to the matchups for divisional weekend. And if I were to rank these in terms of excitement, potential close games, my rankings would probably be number 1, Buffalo, Cincinnati, by a mile. Number 2, probably Dallas, San Francisco. Number 3, Jacksonville, Kansas City. And number 4, Giants, Eagles. Shifting back to last week, prediction-wise, got the Jacksonville game right. I got the Cincinnati game right. Got the Buffalo game right. So the AFC side, 100%. First time I think I've said that in terms of predictions on this show. So glad to see that, maybe the fortunes are changing in terms of that. On the NFC side, I predicted Tampa to beat Dallas. Way off on that one. Predicted the Giants to win a close one against the Vikings, pretty sure. And then obviously San Francisco. So 2 of 3 on that side. Only got 1 wrong. So on to the following week. I think that, looking at my most anticipated game, the Buffalo Bills take on the Cincinnati Bengals. And this is a juggernaut battle. This is the battle we wanted in week 17. And obviously we all understand what happened in that one. Damar Hamlin, which obviously the first and foremost important thing, that he's okay. That's the only thing that mattered coming out of that game. That is still the case. And looking at this matchup, I feel like it's the same thing as it was going into that one. The Bills are this high-flying, high-octane offense that, they can run the ball, but they really enjoy just chucking the ball down the field with Josh Allen at all costs, really. You look at Cincinnati Bengals, I feel like they're more methodical. They have that big playability, but they operate more in that intermediate route of the field. They can hit the deep plays. They can hit short. They can run. Both teams have the potential and capacity to do everything on offense, but they choose to operate in a more ways than others in terms of the Bills, like more of that deep pass style with Josh Allen, whereas Burrow is more methodical. I think the key to the game, and this is very similar to how I looked at it with the Giants-Vikings game, is who forces the turnover and who forces the mistake out of the opposing offense. Does Buffalo force Burrow into 2 turnovers, and is that the difference? Does Cincinnati, force Josh Allen to play like a chicken with his head cut off and run into an interception or fumble? I think it's going to be a very tight game. I think this is your 35-33 or 35-32 type game that's a shootout, that both offenses are able to move the ball. Maybe move that down to a 28-21 type game. I'm going to stick with my pick of Buffalo here. I'm going to stick with that pick in terms of, I think that Buffalo has that team of destiny vibe. I think even with their struggles against Miami, it's good that they got that out of the way. I think the home field environment is so important for this type of game, especially in terms of getting plays in, nerves, those different types of things. Having the crowd at your back, it's an underrated part of things, but I think that it's very important that the Bills have that in their favor, especially after the game. like last week. I think Josh Allen comes back down to earth in terms of the turnovers. I think he is a more consistent player. I think he still hits a few of those deep passes, but I think he's more relaxed. He's not, all over the place, trying to hit every single deep pass down the field. I think Burrow still has a great game, but I think the Bills do tag him for an interception earlier than the Bengals tag Allen for a possible turnover. And I think that's a difference. I think Cincinnati's playing from behind majority of this game. And I do think that Buffalo narrowly pulls out the victory. For my second highly anticipated game, I think that, looking at last week or heading into last week, for whatever reason, the game against Washington changed my view on the Cowboys for a little bit. Because Washington obviously not being a playoff team, seeing them move the ball on the Dallas defense and Dallas not be able to really move the ball in Washington, it kind of threw up the red flags like, okay, like, what's going on here? Why is Dallas struggling all of a sudden? Is Dak okay? And I think, obviously hindsight's 2020, but looking back on it, it seems like that could have been a case of Dallas overlooking their opponent and not, really taking Washington seriously. It's something that, quite frankly, happens in sports all the time. You have these two games back and forth. Dallas already a lock for the playoffs. Dallas may have overlooked Washington, thinking, okay, it's playoffs, got to concentrate on that. Obviously, this game's still important, but we got to make sure we're good for the next week. And they proved, I think, that they belong, obviously, but their victory over Tampa, like I said. I just think the San Francisco is a different beast here. And I'm going to take the 49ers in this game, like I said last week, like I predicted, even though Tampa was supposed to be in the spot and not Dallas. But I think the point stands for whatever team won that game. I personally view the 49ers as a team that is clicking on all cylinders at the right time and is primed to go on that run through the NFC. I don't know how Dallas's offense stacks up. I'm very interested to see how they move the ball against the 49ers, how a little bit hurt offensive line deals with a Niners front four and front seven that, quite frankly, is one of the best in football, if not the best in football. And on the flip side, how does Kyle Shanahan game plan against a very talented Dallas defense? How does Brock Purdy manage against Micah Parsons and some of the Dallas talent on defense? And quite frankly, newsflash, I think he does just fine. I think having McCaffrey, Debo, Kittle, Ayuk, Debo or Ayuk's going to get Trayvon Diggs. As good as Diggs is, he has a tendency to bite on certain routes. I think that there's going to be a point in the game where no one feels like tackling Debo Samuel. And I think the 49ers win this game, a 28-20 type win or a 30-21 type win. I think the 49ers don't win it handily. I think it's a close game. But I think the Cowboys are the team that has to keep fighting from behind in this game. The 49ers are able to control the clock and able to control the time possession to a point where, Dallas is scrambling and trying to get back in this game. So as of now, with the 4 games, we got Buffalo winning, San Francisco winning, Kansas City, Jacksonville. I'm going to stay true to my guns here. I think this is I wouldn't say a blowout, but I think Kansas City wins by 2 scores here. I don't see how Jacksonville's defense is slumming down Mahomes. I think the Chiefs' strength is in the passing game and really the middle of the field, mid-level, not short, not deep, but kind of like that 15, 20-yard range. I think that's their strength. Jacksonville's secondary is not great. Their strength is really on that defensive line coming into their own and getting after the quarterback. Chiefs have an impressive offensive line. Mahomes is Mahomes. We know this. I really don't see how the Jaguars overcome Mahomes. Now, do I think Jacksonville is going to score points in this game? 1,000%. I think as good as the Chiefs' defense has been in recent weeks, I don't think that's going to stop Lawrence from putting up points. I know we got Joseph in the chat saying he has Jacksonville beating Kansas City. That is a very bold prediction. I think you could get some good odds on that if you play that right. But I'm not of that viewpoint. I think that Andy Reid having a week of game planning, or essentially 2 weeks of game planning, I think that Mahomes with 2 weeks of game planning, I think the Chiefs are firing on all cylinders, and I truly don't see a way that they lose this game unless something goes catastrophically wrong for them. I got the Chiefs winning this one by 2 scores, and that leaves us with the last game of this week, which we already discussed. We discussed how we think it's going to be a close game, but the Eagles come out on top, which that would then leave us with a Buffalo, Kansas City neutral site AFC Championship in Atlanta, which I'll be honest, I get it, but it's just so weird seeing AFC Championship neutral site. So who knows how that'll go? That'll be a discussion for next week if we get to that point. And then we would have a 1-2 matchup on the other side of the conference as well between the San Francisco 49ers and the Philadelphia Eagles, which, oh man, that one would be a complete doozy in a great way, though, in terms of probably the two most talented teams in the NFC on a collision course with each other for an opportunity to go to the Super Bowl. So that wraps up our NFL playoff discussion. And now it is time to move on to some teams, specifically the Jets, because I want to talk about some news that is surrounding them and some other NFL news out there that is floating around and regarding other teams in the league. But before we get that, I want to remind you guys that Creative Window Design Center is serving New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Florida. They are fully authorized Hunter Douglas dealer. Contact Jeff at 609-226-0391 for a free consultation. Additionally, as we get to this, All Campus is giving 20% off everything in their store, including hats and shirts to all their subscribers. So make sure to get in on that. I want to remind you guys as well, before we move on, if you guys have any comments, any questions, any, discussion points that you want to bring up, leave them in the chat. Fun, free-flowing show here. Even though we talk about different things, can always bring up other things. What do you think of the Chargers firing Joe Lombardi? What do you think of the rumors surrounding Lamar Jackson, which we're going to get into in regards with the Jets in a little bit? Where do you think Aaron Rodgers ends up? Do you think Tom Brady retires? Where does Derek Carr, Jimmy Garoppolo end up? Talked about all the different sports that are coming up, but the NFL offseason is going to be ripe for discussion as well. It's going to be very interesting to see how a lot of these teams shape up, how a lot of these coaching staffs shape up, and, what really happens in terms of moving forward for a lot of these organizations. So, it's time to get right into the news for the Jets. On this show last week, we discussed, some Jets news, obviously, about how, there may have been potential changes on the offensive side of the ball. There may have been some different changes that could have happened because of the way the Jets finished the year, not scoring a touchdown in the past 3 games of the year, not having a scoring drive for a touchdown in like 30 plus possessions. And those things ended up leading to Mike LaFluer getting fired. And, you're never happy to see anyone go in terms of firings. Well, besides Adam Gase, but that's a different story. But you could really understand the reasoning behind both of these things. Number one, for the pro-fire LaFleur side, I discussed this in an article I wrote. Like I mentioned, the Jets didn't have a touchdown in their last 3 games of the year. They were in the bottom tier of scoring offense once again. They didn't get their skill talent involved a whole lot. But on the other hand, the Jets didn't have a stable QB play. The Jets had a lot of injuries on the O-line, and we discussed how important O-line is for teams. So you take the good with the bad, and, was it worth it to fire him? Is the grass greener on the other side? That's where all of this falls. That's where all it falls. And it comes down to who is the hire. Because who the hire is makes the firing either good or bad in hindsight. And then obviously it goes into how does the offense operate during the season? How does the personnel look? How are you utilizing the personnel? All these different things that go into, the operation of an offense. You don't know a lot of that until the season starts. So a lot of it's open to interpretation. A lot of it's, okay, how is this actually going to go? And that brings us to the different type of candidates that the Jets are looking at. Names that have been floated out there are Patriots tight end coach Nick Caley, Eagles quarterback coach Brian Johnson, former Colts offensive coordinator Marcus Brady. Seen Joe Brady's name floated out there a little bit. You've seen, Frank Reich floated out there. Obviously, Cliff Kingsbury was a name out there before he decided he wanted to, quote unquote, retire to Thailand and not really take any job offers at the moment. Yeah, Greg Olson, Sr. You have Nathaniel Hackett. You got Matt Nagy potentially, Darren Bevel. There's so many names out there. And I think what it really comes down to is who is the Jets quarterback? And that's the predicament the Jets find themselves in, right? How do you pick an offensive coordinator without knowing your quarterback? And how do you pick a quarterback without knowing your offensive coordinator? And that's where, the quote unquote the plan comes into play, right? You have to have a plan if you fire someone. It's the same thing with cutting a player, right? A lot of people, I always see this. It's always cut this guy, get rid of this guy, get rid of this guy. Okay. If you get rid of him, who are you replacing him with? It's always, always, always so easy to discuss getting rid of someone, but it's never easy discussing who to replace him with. Now, personally, I, on a quarterback front, have been pro Derek Carr. And I know that is very controversial for some people, especially in the Jets landscape, but I think Carr would be a nice, stable presence in terms of operating an offense. He would be a nice, stable presence in terms of Jets quarterback play. Probably would be one of their best quarterbacks in franchise history, which isn't saying a lot, but still. Carr can make all the throws. He can run an offense. He won't kill you in games like the Jets quarterback play under Zach Wilson, Mike White, Joe Flacco has at times. If you go the Carr route, getting Greg Olson, who helped Derek Carr have some of the best years of his career, would be a great idea. Now, if you get an Aaron Rodgers type, if you trade for Aaron Rodgers, I'd lean more towards a Nathaniel Hackett. Aaron Rodgers has vouched for him. Aaron Rodgers has, really pounded the table for him. You could argue the whole reason Denver hired him was because they thought they were trading for Aaron Rodgers. And despite disastrous season under Hackett, Hackett has had good seasons as an offensive coordinator. He has ran good offenses. Now you get a Lamar Jackson type. Who knows? You see the rumors floating about he didn't show up to the game. He wants a fully guaranteed contract. The vague Instagram stories. You never know what can happen. You get a Lamar type that opens the door to everything. You get who's the offensive coordinator there? You get maybe a Darren Bevel who had Russell Wilson in Seattle. Do you look for someone that specializes in RPO types? Like, there is so many options that the Jets are probably going to interview. And quite frankly, this discussion revolving around the Jets offseason and revolving around what this team should do really can't start until you get the quarterback position right. Because the whole offseason, the whole future outlook for Robert Saleh and Joe Douglas is predicated on the fact that they get the offensive coordinator and the quarterback right. And you really can't do either of those things until you have one or the other. Personally, I think you got to get the quarterback first and then get the offensive coordinator. But how are you selling a quarterback on a team that doesn't have the offensive coordinator? Are you allowing the quarterback to have input into who the OC is going to be? I personally think that'd be a good idea. But I'm also not in an organization doing that. So these are the different issues that the Jets are running into. And this is the problem you run into when you fire your OC and you potentially don't have a plan in mind. You're left floating like dust in the wind. You're all over the place. You don't know where you're going to land. And I'm obviously saying this as someone who has no idea what's going on in that building. I'm saying this as someone that has no idea, what is happening on a true, organizational basis. But the full discussion of who do you cut? Who do you target in free agency? Obviously, draft is a different story because you have positions in need, like offensive line, like linebacker, like safety, potentially wide out and edge. But the crux of it is that when you need a quarterback and you don't have anyone in place from an offensive standpoint, it's hard to really lay out where a team needs to go and where a team needs to concentrate on. My personal opinion, I would love a Joe Brady type. I would love a Frank Reich. Reich, I feel like, would be dream option number one for me. I think he's a really good play caller. He showed that with the Eagles in his time there. Quite frankly, I think he showed that in his time in India as well at times. Joe Brady, he was one of my favorite candidates when he was getting interviewed for head coaching and coordinator jobs back in 2019. Wanted him with the Jets. Obviously didn't end up happening. You ended up with Adam Gase. But I think he would be a really interesting type to bring in the building and have him work with whoever's at quarterback. But at the same time, if you bring him in and bring a veteran mind in to work with him, like, for example, I've seen a name like Bill Callahan floating out there who could work with Brady. Wouldn't that be the same thing as keeping Mike LaFluer and then bringing in Bill Callahan? Like, those are the type of issues you run into. Every candidate isn't going to be flawless. Each candidate's going to have their flaws, and each candidate's going to be like, okay, if you hire him, why don't you just keep the other guy? And then that brings you to, obviously, how does it play out? But, we're going to have plenty of time to discuss all this. It'll be very interesting to see how the Jets go about this. And I'm personally excited because, as I've mentioned before, it's a very pivotal offseason. And it's different in a sense of this team has the talent to compete. This team was probably a few wins away from being a playoff team playing this past weekend. So they're really not that far away, but they need to have a solid offseason, set a solid foundation to a point where, they're able to compete, get to that 9-10 win mark, and truly cement themselves as a competitive, above average team in the AFC. So before we move on, we got Cowboys legends for life. I'm happy for the Giants winning again to play the Eagles, but where do you get the idea that the GM and the Eagles are the two most talented in the NFC East? I never said I don't think I ever said the Giants were more talented than the Cowboys. I said the Giants were a very talented team, that they were going to compete against the Eagles, but I think it's pretty evident from their matchups this year that the Cowboys have a little bit more talent than the Giants at this point of both teams. I think the Giants are on the upswing, and I think there's a shot that after another solid offseason, the Giants leap over the Cowboys. But I don't think the Giants are past Dallas's level just yet. And then we got Rolex Ape 16. Very interesting name there. The stats talk for itself. Eagles team. Yeah, I agree with that. I think the Eagles are a very talented team, and I think they are going to have a very good weekend in terms of how the game is going to play out. So we shall see with that. All right. So moving on from there, MLB talk. MLB talk's always fun, especially at the point of the off season where it is the middle of January and there is literally nothing going on in terms of moves because everything has really happened already. Looking at the Mets, obviously they've had some introductory press conferences, introduced Adam Ottavino, the whole Carlos Correa debacle we talked about last week. I don't think that, and to really surmise my points on that, I don't think it's, dire that the Mets missed out on him, but I also don't think that it's great that the Mets missed out on him. I think they're still a high-level competitive team that is going to make a nice run at the playoffs, but I feel like having Correa would have probably put them over the top in the NL over a lot of different teams, putting them on that same level as a Dodgers in terms of pure talent. But we are now 30 days away from pitchers and catchers reporting, and I'm very excited for this season. And I figured on today's show, I would give a few outlooks for the Mets and a few outlooks for the Yankees and kind of just, from a wide lens perspective before the offseason ends, maybe what I want to see from the teams as we head towards spring training. So for the remainder of the offseason, I really would like to see the Mets add a fourth outfielder. Now, if we look at, and if I have this pulled up, it'd be great. If we look at the MLB free agents here, and we look at outfielders, the remaining outfielders, there are still some guys that are, available that I think could help the Mets. Now, number one on that list, personally for me, would be Adam Duvall. Now, Duvall is a member of, and I'll take a pause here before we get there. Duvall is a former member, currently, of the Atlanta Braves. And I think what Duvall brings is good defense and the ability to provide a little bit of offensive production where, maybe you want to give a guy like Marte a break or DH him, or you want to give a guy like potentially McNeil, if he's in left, a little bit of a break, or something along those lines, or Kana, or platoon Kana and Duvall, or however you want to go about it. I think Duvall is a nice addition potentially for the Mets at like a probably 2-year, probably $16 or $12 million deal, maybe with a club option for the second year, something along those lines. Now, the Red Sox are apparently talking to him as well. Seems like he has a bit of a market. How high do the Mets want to run that price? Who knows? You also have guys like Tommy Pham, David Peralta, and Jurickson Profar in free agency, and then you reach a tier where you have Tyler Naquin, who, was decent at times, but wasn't really the fourth outfielder that the Mets probably needed. Then you're on to guys like Kevin Pillar, Ben Gamel, Alex Dickerson, Lewis Brinson, that type of tier. Out of those remaining names, I'm personally really interested in Jurickson Profar. I think he brings enough offensive production to the table to be satisfied, and then he offers great positional versatility. He's a guy that can play outfield. He's a guy that can play infield, all over the infield, in fact. Second, sure, second, third, short, all these different spots in the outfield where you have a guy that needs a rest, you can plug Profar in there. I think having that Swiss Army knife type in both McNeil and Profar would be a very nice addition to the Mets, and being able to, have that type of flexibility be very beneficial for their offense. My second need for this team, or the second thing that I would want to see this team do, is, add another relief pitcher or two. And I'm not saying to break the bank, but you have some guys at a little bit of a lower level where you could add them. You got a Zach Britton type who has been linked to the Mets. Would be another lefty to add to the bullpen, and I think would be a pretty decent addition, but nothing that breaks the bank. You obviously have Mike LaFluer, who I think would be a great addition. The Mets tried to trade for him at the trade deadline, just adding more depth there. You obviously also have Will Smith. You have Will Harris, Andrew Chafin, Ian Kennedy, Trevor Rosenthal, Scott Oberg, Alex Colomé, Chad Green, Archie Bradley, Alex Reyes. Like there are options out there. And the reason I think the Mets should add another arm or two in the bullpen is you can never have enough bullpen arms. You've seen what has happened in the past for the Mets when they had these injuries in the bullpen. You are left scrambling. You're left scrambling and trying to figure out, okay, how do we, surmount this? How do we figure out, how to fill this hole, to fill that hole? If you add, let's say, a Chafin and a Fulmer, or a Reyes and a Britton, if you fill another lefty spot and another righty spot, I think the Mets are in a great position to have a pretty decent bullpen. And no, none of these guys are quote unquote above average arms and aren't going to be quote unquote, have insane production. But bullpens and relief pitchers especially are vary on a year-to-year basis so much that you could sign 3 of these guys and they could all have above average years. You could sign 2 of those guys and one guy could have an above average year. Nothing is set in stone with bullpen arms. And I think that's the most important thing. You just got to shoot your shot with some of them and hope that it works out. And my last thing that I would love to see the Mets do before the offseason ends is make a trade. Maybe not a Brian Reynolds type, but add another starting pitcher for one of your depth guys. Add another bullpen arm that maybe is a little better than what's on the market already. I personally would be very interested to see in checking on one of the Miami Marlins pitchers, but that may be more expensive in prospect capital than what the Mets are willing to offer. So that's where I stand with them. On the Yankees side of things, I think starting pitching, 1,000%. I would add another starter. Looking at that market, feel like that market's a little bit dry and barren at the moment, but you still got Zach Greinke out there. Michael Wacha, I think, would be a nice back-end addition. He showed some signs of life last year. Dylan Bundy as well. Then you have a guy like maybe a Chad Cole, a Garrett Richards, maybe you take a flyer on. Like these type of guys where you're adding them for the Yankees is like a 5th starter and hoping that they just give you decent production to kind of flip that rotation back to the Garrett Cole, the Carlos Rodon, the Luis Severinos of the world. Similar to the Mets, I also would be looking for relief pitchers. We went over some of them. Zach Britton reunion could be great. I don't think you're bringing back Aroldis Chapman, especially after the end to last year and keeping the same manager. I think a Michael Fulmer could be interesting for them. And then very similar to the Mets, but I think in a more, decent capacity. I think they need another outfielder, potentially start. And I think Profar would fit that bill great because I think Profar starting for the Padres last year did a pretty good job. And I think having that positional versatility, once again, so important in today's MLB. especially with the lack of the shift now. I think he has the speed to cover ground in the outfield. He has a good arm. He has experience playing there. I think that'd be great for the Yankees. Pretty short, but that's really all I got MLB wise. Not too many, huge rumors floating out there right now. Obviously, it's if a Shohei Ohtani trade was on the horizon, we'd be talking about that. If Juan Soto extension was on the horizon, we'd be talking about that. But there's not really much news going on. It's how did the Mets prepare for this season? How did the Yankees prepare for this season? Are the Mets set up for success? Same with it's more of that type of stuff right now. So, as with football, as the baseball season approaches, you're going to hear more on this show. A lot more baseball talk on this show. And it's going to be very interesting to see, how these teams do as things start to move forward. Moving on to our last two segments of the show, Knicks basketball and New York basketball and New York hockey, to be more precise here. As always, on this show, we start with the Knicks. Now, the New York Knicks are what I would like to call the epitome of up and down. 2 up, 1 down, 3 up, 2 down. It's all over the place. And to be honest with you, they're in a very good spot. They're a very competitive team. But I think, and we'll get to this in a minute, I think they need to do something to get them over the edge. Currently, the Knicks are 3 games behind the Cavaliers and the Sixers for 5th and 4th place. In the East, they are 4.5 out of 3rd place and 2nd place. They are a game ahead of the Heat, 2 games ahead of the Pacers, 2.5 ahead of the Hawks, and 4.5 ahead of the Bulls. So as of now, they're in comfortable quote-unquote playoff or play-in range. And looking at their past 4 games, the Knicks, they defeated, we're pulling up the right range of the schedule. They defeated the Pacers 119-113, defeated the Wizards 112-108, defeated the Pistons 117-104, and then lost in a heartbreaking overtime loss to the Toronto Raptors yesterday, 123-121. Now, the Knicks starters have been great, to be honest with you. Between RJ Barrett, Julius Randle, which very happy to see him back on track. Between those two, and specifically the addition of Jalen Brunson, consistently having close to 30 points a game, 7 rebounds a game, he's playing great. The Knicks need either a shooter off the bench, or bench depth. Because right now, looking at this team, Obi isn't really playing enough to be making that type of impact. Isaiah Hartenstein just isn't getting the job done. You have Quickly and Grimes, but, Miles McBride, just 0 points yesterday off the bench in 6 minutes. You add a Gary Trent Jr. type. You add a Alex Caruso type, where you're getting scoring, defense, production off the bench, to not consistently let Randall play 42 minutes, RJ play 49 minutes, Brunson play 43 minutes, like they did yesterday. These high-level minutes that are going to potentially bite the Knicks down the road. You need to add guys that can take the weight off of them, whether that's a Gary Trent Jr. on a lower end, whether that's a Caruso on the lower end, whether you trade for a superstar like Zach LaVine, whether you trade for, a Pascal Siakam or OG Anunoby. I really feel like the Knicks need to make a move of that caliber. I feel like they need to make a move that really allows them to not run their superstars, and not just superstars, but like key players into the ground. And if you have a guy that can work on the unit with Emmanuel Quickly, a guy that can work on the unit with, RJ Barrett, and you can allow those guys to rest and not play as much, then I think you're going to have a lot more success. That's truly where I land with the Knicks. coming up on their schedule, they play the Washington Wizards again tomorrow, the Atlanta Hawks on Friday. Then Sunday, they play the Raptors again, followed by a fun stretch with the Cavaliers, Celtics, Nets, and Lakers, which will probably show a lot about how far this team has come. Looking at the standings for the East, the Brooklyn Nets are losing some separation with the Boston Celtics, who are by far the best team in the East and currently have the best record in the NBA. They have at least a 4.5 game minimum lead. Nets keeping their head above water with KD out, but they have lost their last two, losing to the Celtics and the Thunder. They play the Spurs tonight. Then to finish out the week, they play the Suns, Jazz, and Warriors. Not much to say with Brooklyn. They obviously need the Brooklyn obviously needs KD back. Huge critical part of their roster. Very interested to see how they fare in this coming week, especially with the Spurs. I know Kyrie Irving's dealing with some sort of injury as well. Very interested to see how that goes. And wrapping up with the Rangers, they currently, if we check the standings, are in third place in the Metropolitan Division, have a 3-point lead on the Capitals. They are 4 points behind the Devils and 5 behind the Hurricanes. If we're looking at the Atlantic, they would only be behind the Lightning, who sit in third, and would be way above the Panthers, who are at 46. So technically the Rangers are in comfortable wild card range at the moment. The Metro Division is insane with the Hurricanes, Devils, Rangers, Capitals, Penguins, and Islanders all being above 50 points or at 50 points. In terms of the Rangers games, they lost a heartbreaker to the Canadiens, which, quite frankly, looking at the standings with how bad Montreal has been, probably shouldn't have happened, but it did. Sometimes, like I said, you overlook a team and you lose. And the Rangers bounced back last night, defeating the Blue Jackets 3-1. Huge game against the Bruins coming up on Thursday. Then they got the Panthers on Monday and the Maple Leafs on Wednesday. Flipping to the Islanders here, obviously, they are 23-18-4, tied with the Penguins at 50 points, making them 4 games behind the Capitals. Very tight Metro Division. Very excited to see how that develops and how that turns out over the next coming games, weeks, and months of the season. All right. So I'm going to spend a little time here. If you guys have any questions about football, baseball, basketball, hockey, fire them in the chat. See JT56 saying good luck versus Philly. And also saying, let's talk about football. So JT, you got anything, just throw it in the chat. I've personally open to discussing anything football related if you want it. So, just fire it in there. We're here for a little bit more. So open to anything regarding that. Otherwise, I think good refresher to look at the NFL draft order, seeing what has been updated with the current games. So obviously the top half of the draft has been set, picks 1 through 18. You got the top 10 of Chicago, Houston, Arizona, Indianapolis, Denver pick going to Seattle, Rams pick going to Detroit. Then you got Vegas, Atlanta, Carolina, and Philadelphia, who has New Orleans pick. Then 11 through 18, Tennessee, Cleveland with Houston, Cleveland, who gives their pick to Houston, the Jets, Patriots, Green Bay, Washington, Pittsburgh, and Detroit. Then the wild card round of losers. This is the updated part of the show in terms of the draft order. Tampa Bay at 19, Seattle at 20, Miami's pick forfeited at 21, Chargers at 22, Baltimore at 23, and the Minnesota Vikings at 24. Then you obviously have Jacksonville, the Giants, Dallas, Cincinnati, San Francisco, Buffalo, Kansas City, and Philadelphia all still alive and not having their position determined. In terms of the teams that have been eliminated, I'd say Tampa Bay is a wild card. Could see them picking a quarterback potentially, depending on Brady. Could see them going with not linebacker, but trench play on the D line. Seattle, I think their first pick's going to be a high-level pick, potentially Jalen Carter or Will Anderson if they fall there. I think they could be looking secondary help with the 20th pick. Chargers, I think they need a deep threat, but not in round one. Maybe solidify that O-line or have another pick in the trenches on the defensive side of the ball. Baltimore, number one receiver, 100%. That changes if Lamar leaves, but we will cross that bridge when we get there. And then the Vikings, I think their Vikings are more so best player available. All right, so I think that brings us to the end of another great show. Thank you guys for joining me on another fun ride today. It's my last show while I am in Florida. We will be back in the great state of New Jersey next week. We will have my new co-host on to discuss all things New York sports. Going to be a fun week to discuss football. Going to be a fun week to discuss baseball, basketball, hockey, whatever else you guys decide to throw in the chat and talk about. So thank you guys for joining me once again on another great edition of the show. It's been real. It's been fun. It's been real fun. We'll catch you next time.